Welcome to Conversations with the Planets, a podcast with Lori Kaufman and Alicia Cielle Heiser, where we root the wisdom of the stars into our lived experiences here on Earth and weave the power of diverse healing modalities together with astrology. And as you can see, Lori and I are finally together in person.
Yeah.
Yeah,
For the first time since we started the podcast.
really, yes. We haven't seen each other since December of last year because she lives in Ohio and I live in Oregon. And we're in Denver right now for a Hellenistic Time Lords retreat with Demetra George that starts tomorrow. So very exciting. And we wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to record some podcasts together in person. And we're starting a series on talking about essential dignity. And this episode will be talking about what it means to have a planet in its own sign, which is called having a planet in domicile or in their home. So yeah.
Yeah.
um, so really the main thing to understand when you have a planet in its own sign is that means that this planet has access to resources to carry about its significations. And so maybe should we could just go through the list of what planets rule what signs?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking of structuring it as going through each planet individually.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
works.
Yeah.
But just kind of like a general overview is that they do this. So when planets are in their own signs, they're very well resourced to bring about their significations. So if you have,
Yeah.
a strong Saturn, then you're going to be working hard and maybe be good at being alone and building things. And if you have a strong Jupiter, you'll be good at having hope and optimism and making meaning out of things. And so whatever the planet signifies when it's in its own sign, that means that it's very able to do that. And it's kind of like an analogy I use a lot living in the American cultural context is having a planet in its own sign is like it's its own landlord. Like you're the homeowner. Like it's literally domicile, which the roots of domicile would be the house. Like a planet is in its own house. And so, if you're your own landlord and you own your own house and your washing machine goes out, you don't have to wait for someone else to fix it. You're the one that fixes it. But also, it can be work as well to
Yeah.
maintain
You
this
have to
place.
fix it.
Yeah, no one else is gonna
You
fix it
can't
for
just
you.
call maintenance. Yeah.
But it's better than, if a planet isn't in its own sign and the ruler of that sign is in bad condition or something, then that would be like having a landlord who you keep calling and you're like, will you please fix my washing machine? And they never show up. Whereas when a planet is in domicile, it has the resources to take care of that
Yeah.
area.
Yeah, it's basically like being given the tools to do whatever it is that you are wanting to do. So that planet has the ability to basically carry out whatever goal that planet wanted to carry out. And I always think about when I think about the dignity of a planet, I like to use a lot of metaphor and basically use like storytelling to help, especially when I'm giving readings to clients who don't really understand this stuff as much. I love to like speak in metaphor so that people understand exactly what it is that it means.
Yeah. And so, yeah, landlord is one good metaphor. One that Jason Hawley uses a lot that I like to kind of problematize, land ownership. Because also just understanding we both are, really steeped in Hellenistic astrology as one of the main techniques we use in our astrological practice. And that comes
Yeah.
from ancient Greece. And the concept of domicile comes from Hellenistic astrology. And that is a cultural context in which slave ownership was a thing, in which, patriarchy and land ownership and being the lord of your house, and a lot of, pretty problematic cultural contexts that we don't want to be replicating now. And so you can also think of a planet being in its own sign as a planet being a custodian or a steward of the land through which it walks. And, I got that teaching from Jason Hawley. And what does that mean? I live in front of these gorgeous woods behind my house, and I can't walk right now because I just got ACL reconstruction surgery. But when I can walk, I am up in those woods every single day. I am walking through them. I am seeing which plants are blooming at different times of the year. And I have a really close personal relationship with that land. When I hear that an oak tree is about to be cut down, I'm, fighting to make sure that that oak tree is protected. If I see trash, I'm picking it up. I'm familiar with this land and I'm tending to it and caring to it. And so you can think of that as a way that a planet, Mercury and Gemini is going to be really responsible for caring for the land that Gemini is.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good way of wording that. And especially with the word rulership, which gets tossed around a lot
Mhm.
today too. Because it's not necessarily that that planet is ruling that sign. I mean, it is, but
Mhm.
it's in like in a weird way of wording that. Um, it feels like there's a lot of other ways to kind of go about understanding the significations.
Absolutely.
Um,
And I'm just pulling up the Thema Mundi so we can use that as a teaching tool while we talk about this as well.
yeah, that's always the best resource for
Yeah.
sure too.
Do you have anything
Um,
else to say about the metaphors?
I do actually want to say one thing about modern astrology
Yes.
changing.
Yes.
Yeah. So when modern astrology was created and significations changed, the biggest difference between Hellenistic astrology, traditional astrology, and the more modern take is the fact that, the planets ended at Saturn
Mhm.
before.
Like
And
visibly, like you could only
right.
see Saturn in the sky until the telescope was invented. And
Mhm.
in the 1700s, they discovered Uranus, who, except for like once or twice a year, you can only see Uranus through a telescope. And then
Mhm.
same with Neptune and Pluto. Like those were not planets that the ancients were working with because they could not see them.
They weren't like invented yet. They weren't
Yeah.
found yet. And so the significations of a lot of the more ancient rules didn't have those planets in interpretation. So in the modern day, and we both use the outer planets, but not like we use the more personal planets, the inner planets. And so a lot of the significations of Saturn changed in modern astrology because it was no longer the doom and gloom final planet. It all of a sudden there was Uranus for that, and then there was Neptune for that, and now there's Pluto for that. And I mean, that could be its whole own episode. I talk about that a lot. But something that's really interesting is that, when they found these outer planets, they decided to basically give them signs as well. So then Uranus was given Aquarius, and then Neptune was given Pisces, and Pluto was given Scorpio. And so the significations and the signs changed and adapted in the times to work with these new planets, which isn't necessarily wrong, but it does change a lot of the significations of the signs. And I
Mhm.
argue Aquarius a lot really changes.
Yeah, Aquarius, when you look at Aquarius as ruled by Saturn, which is a
Mm.
very,
Yeah.
rigid, structured, boundaried planet, that is very different than a Uranus ruled by, or an Aquarius ruled by Uranus. That's all like chaotic and unexpected and revolutionary.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think to some extent, diving into Aquarius a little bit, it kind of is both of those things, right? Like I always think of Aquarius as the outside of Saturn's rings, whereas Capricorn is more the internal of the rings. It's structure, it's the inside. Um, so it is in some ways trying to break down the structure that is no longer working so that it can rebuild. But it's not usually as chaotic as Uranus makes it sound. It's usually a little more like planned
Systemic.
out. Systemic is a great
Yeah.
word. Yeah.
Like Saturn loves systems and order,
Yeah.
even if
Yeah.
they're like floating out in space.
Right.
You can do
Right.
that.
Yeah. And that's Aquarius though.
Yeah, it's like the atmosphere is how Diana Rose Harper talks about
Yeah.
Saturn and Aquarius, which I think is a really good image for like Saturn ruled air, like the atmosphere that
Right.
holds us all together.
Right. Because we have gravity. Like it's not. We're not floating
Mhm.
away.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and so one last thing we'll say about kind of technique with planetary rulership, and then we can dig into talking about which planets rule which signs and what that means, is that from a Hellenistic perspective, when a planet rules a sign, that means that whatever sign that falls on in your house system in your chart, like for example,
Mhm.
I'm a Libra rising, so then Venus rules my first house. So then Venus is in charge of my body and my personality and my appearance and those sorts of things. Whereas Lori, as a Cancer rising, has the moon. Wherever Venus or the moon are in our charts, Lori has the moon in charge of her first house. And so when you use the ancient rulership system based off of the Thema Mundi that we're about to share, then you get these really rich significations of, well, where's Mars in my chart and what does Mars rule? And then, if you have Mars, like I have Mars in charge of relationships and money for me. And so then there's a connection between relationships and money for me, as those are Aries and Scorpio. And wherever Mars is in my chart, he is going to be focused on bringing relationships and money into my life and tending to them. And so it gives you a lot of really rich tools for seeing how, like, topically and literally astrology shows up in your life by working with both the ancient rulership system and also whole sign houses is how you would use this specific technique. And then I'll also say that, there can be a lot of arguments between like traditional astrologers, modern astrologers, people with all their different techniques, and
house systems.
Especially house systems. And humans have made sense of ourselves in relationship to the sky forever. And there's a million ways to do it. And there's a million ways to take meaning from that. And there's a lot of really powerful things that can come through with modern astrological techniques. There's a lot of really powerful things that can come through with ancient astrological techniques. So we're not saying anything is right or wrong. We're just talking about the techniques that we personally work with that seem to work really well in our client work and understanding our own lives and the lives of the people we care about.
Yeah, and a big thing too, which I also feel like could be its own episode, is the fact that modern astrology is backed in more psychology. So that's kind of where that big difference comes in.
Yeah.
Is that it's going to tell you more how to work with those planets, which
psychologically
like in
your internal space.
Yes. And whereas a more Hellenistic traditional sense is going to say, yeah, this is what happens to you.
Yeah, like
so
when
this is how to deal with it.
when you were like the king back in the day, like you wanted to know how, like, are you going to win this war? When are you going to be healthy? Are you going to lose your rulership? You didn't really care about, like, psychology wasn't even invented until like what, the
150 years
yeah,
ago?
like so recently. So like ancient astrology is very literal of, if the planets are doing this in the sky, how do we tangibly feel that in our daily lives? Like, is my boss going to yell at me today? Is my dog going to get sick? Like, that's how it's focused.
It's more backed in the reality of life.
Yeah, not to say that psychology is not reality as well,
but that's more internalized. It's traditional astrology is the study of fate and fortune. So what is your fate? What is your fortune? And sometimes it's really important to note that if there is something that's really difficult in your chart, if you do have a detriment planet, or planet that's not doing so well and isn't able to bring about its significations that it really wants to, that area of life might be more difficult. And that's okay, but you might have other areas of life that aren't more difficult. And so that's, I think, another big difference is modern astrology is going to say, oh, but it's okay. You can still manifest it or whatever. And sometimes the reality of maybe you can't, but that's okay, because like, your career's going really well, like, and finding the other way.
So we just got a pillow delivery to the hotel because I tore my ACL and need to like keep my leg lifted. So we had to pause. But yeah, we're back. And what I was also just thinking about, the point Lori was making is also, when a planet is in its own sign, that means it's able to bring about its significations in a culturally acceptable, like traditional, normal way. And so if you have Venus in her own sign, you're going to be very good at being pleasing to others and being connected with others and making art that may be like traditionally aesthetically pleasing. But like I have Venus in Scorpio where she's in detriment, and we'll do a separate episode on what that means. And that just means that I'm a little more countercultural in the way that my Venus stuff shows up. And so like I might like a little darker, more morose stuff. I might be covered in tattoos, which now is very culturally acceptable, but in different times and places. I mean, it's culturally acceptable because I live in Oregon and like in my generation, everyone has tattoos, but still plenty of people of different generations and different cultural contexts would, think this isn't appropriate, right? So it's like when a planet's in its own sign, it's able to do things in like the expected, traditional, culturally like common sort of way. And yeah, it's like moving past the concept of good and bad. Like it's not necessarily good to have a planet in its own sign. It just means you have a very strong planet.
Yeah, so my favorite metaphor that we've been talking about is kind of, I think, a great place to start, but the metaphor of Mars. Mars wanting to cause violence to whatever whatever it's doing. And so Mars in domicile, Mars in its home is going to be Mars in Aries and Scorpio. So that's basically Mars being handed a gun and saying, okay, go cause violence now, right?
Mhm.
So Mars with a gun is going to be able to do whatever it wants to do, right? Nobody's going to mess with Mars with a gun. But then, Mars in some of the neutral signs is basically Mars being handed a knife. And, the knife isn't necessarily going to beat the gun, but
Yeah.
it has a fighting chance against each other, quite literally.
Hmm.
And Mars in detriment or
It's
fall,
like Mars with like a bubble gun.
right? Like
Like shooting bubbles.
yeah, like
You're like, ah.
Mars and Taurus, like, uh-oh. But what I love about a detriment planet, and we'll talk more about this in the next episode, but that Mars in Taurus or Mars in Cancer or Mars in Libra is going to put the bubble gun down and learn how to fight, right? So it has a chance. And so those fighting skills that those Mars placements are going to create might in the long run be way more valuable for when Mars and Aries misplaced its gun, doesn't know where it is, right?
Mhm.
And so there are going to be moments like that. And I talk a lot about another metaphor I use a lot is like a domicile planet is basically like the spoiled rich kid, right? Like the
Mhm.
kid who's given everything in childhood. Um, you know, they never have to worry about anything and their life is easy, and that's kind of great. That's kind of awesome. But then like that neutral ground is going to be the kid who was given what they needed but not always what they wanted. And a kid with it, or like the planet in detriment, is going to be like a poor kid who maybe had homelessness that they had to deal with at certain points in their life, or food insecurity, or whatever. And so when you look at it that way, it's like, well, that poor kid might grow up to be a very motivated adult who will never let themselves be poor again because they've seen it, right? They've seen the bottom and they don't want to go back there. So they're going to work really hard to manifest whatever it can. They're going to try to create the best life it possibly can for itself. And whereas that like domicile placement, like that's super cool. You were handed everything, but is that necessarily a person you want to hang out with? Like,
Mhm.
and so yeah, it's kind of finding that the pros and the cons, because having a very well placed planet might make that area of life really easy, which is great. And most people have a handful of both, right?
Mhm.
Like most people have some well placed things, some neutrally placed things, and some poorly placed things. And
Mhm.
that's going to be normal. I don't think I've ever seen a chart that's all good or all bad.
Like literally the Thema Mundi incarnate in a person,
Yeah, that'd be
which
terrifying.
yeah, that would be a very powerful person.
Yeah.
Which yeah, I'll
Yeah,
go
for
ahead
sure.
and share the screen. If I can find where that is. Share screen. There it is. And open up the Thema Mundi. So this is the Thema Mundi, which is an ancient teaching tool and is called the birth chart of the world. And so it's used to show which planets are in domicile. And so it's a Cancer rising chart with the moon in Cancer. So the moon rules Cancer. And then you have the sun in Leo in the second house. And then from there, you move out. And so you have Mercury and Virgo in the third house. And if you went backwards, you'd also have Mercury ruling Gemini as well
Yeah.
in the 12th house. So Mercury
It goes
rules.
both directions.
Yeah, so Mercury rules the two signs closest to the luminaries, the sun and moon, the light givers. So you have Mercury ruling Virgo, Mercury ruling Gemini.
I like to think about that too as like Mercury can't be any more than 28 degrees away
Mhm.
from the sun. So it like is the closest on either
Yes.
side of the two luminaries.
Yeah.
And then the same with Venus. That's why
Mhm.
Venus is next after that, because it can't be more than two signs away. It can't be more than 48 degrees
Yeah.
away from the sun. So thinking about it that way, that's the order.
Yeah,
of
that
the
makes sense,
planet,
right? Yeah, that Mercury and Venus are literally tethered to the sun.
Yes.
And so after that, you have Venus in the fourth house ruling Libra, as well as Venus up here ruling Taurus. And then, and this is also, once you move away from the luminaries, this is also in the order of planetary speed. So Mercury moves faster than Venus, Venus moves faster than Mars, right? So you have Mars in Scorpio, ruling Scorpio, and then Mars also rules Aries. And then you have Jupiter ruling Sagittarius and Jupiter ruling Pisces. And then because Saturn is the planet that's farthest from the luminaries, right? Saturn, again, if you're just looking at the sky with your naked eye, Saturn is the end of the solar system. Saturn is much farther from the sun than Mercury is. That's why Saturn appears to be so dim in the sky. So then you have Saturn across from the luminaries. So you have Saturn ruling both Capricorn and Aquarius. And
so Saturn, not Capricorn, is going to be always the opposite of the sun and the moon. So then the oppositions will come in.
yes, and we could even do a whole episode on aspect
Yeah.
theory, right? Because you can get into aspect theory with the Thema Mundi. I'm in a class with Kristen Mathis and Drew Levanti right now about the Orphics, and we've been talking a lot about the Thema Mundi and Orphism, and how the Thema Mundi was probably influenced by Orphic thought. And there's just like so many heady rabbit holes you can go down.
Yeah.
Seer and Sundry recently made a whole Thema Mundi edition of like their talismanic materia, and because Kate realized that if she like started while Saturn was still in Capricorn and domicile a few years ago, that she could get all of the planets in domicile. So she did that and made this like whole talismanic, like it feels like psychedelic. I have these bath salts that I'll take that are like Thema Mundi bath salts that have like Moon in Cancer, Sun in Leo, Mercury in Virgo, Venus in Libra, Mars in Scorpio, Jupiter in Sag, and Saturn in Capricorn. So there's like so many different ways that you can play around with the Thema Mundi. It's really beautiful to think about just like the shapes and the geometry here. But this is one of the reasons why we work with the traditional planetary rulership model, because the ancient Greeks were very interested in symmetry, and the Thema Mundi is set up in a very symmetrical way when you look at planetary rulership. And then if you bring in, the modern astrology would say that Pluto rules Scorpio, that Uranus rules Aquarius, and that Neptune rules Pisces, and then that throws off the symmetry of the Thema Mundi model.
Yeah.
And so, like, yes, the outer planets are very important, but they don't, especially when you're looking at topics, like if you were a Cancer rising, and then you have like your moon is in charge of your first house, right? Your Venus is in charge of your fourth house. And it's like Pluto is not in charge of your fifth house. That's Mars who's ruling your fifth house. And not that Pluto is not important, but Pluto is just doing slightly different things than being like the steward or custodian or landlord of whatever those house significations are.
It is nice being a Cancer rising too when you read the ancient books, because it is always set up as my chart.
And one reason
I don't have to do the math.
One reason why Cancer is on the rising sign in the Thema Mundi is because in ancient Egyptian times, life was connected to the flooding of the Nile every year, which was, what would give them agricultural abundance. And the flooding of the Nile was signified by the heliacal rising of Sirius in the sky, which is connected to Cancer, especially a few thousand years ago.
And the association of Cancer being the mother as well. So like birthing and you entering the earth in the first house. Like
the fertility of
taking your first
the
breath.
water.
Yeah, fertility.
Yeah.
So
the womb. Should we just go through each sign in order and kind of talk about the planets?
I want to say one more thing about the Thea Mundi, and then but one thing I think about a lot in opposition, and this really could be its own episode too, is the luminaries are always opposite Saturn, and then Venus and Mars are always opposite each other, and then so Venus
and
Mars.
Libra opposes Mars and Aries. Venus and Taurus opposes Mars and Scorpio.
And then Mercury and Jupiter are always going to oppose each other
or square
as well.
Or square, right?
Or
so
square,
like Mercury
yes, but I mean
squares
just in
itself.
the
Mercury,
opposition.
yes, Mercury opposes. And then also, we'll get into a whole episode on detriment, but if a planet's in its own sign, it's in its own home. So then if you had the moon in Capricorn, that's when you have your planet in detriment. She's like in exile. She's very far from home. If you have Mercury in Sag, you have Mercury very far from home. So it's always the opposite of the planetary rulership is where the planet would then be in detriment.
Yeah. So opposition is always a big thing to look at.
Yeah.
So if you have the ruler of your first house in your seventh house, that's always your chart ruler being in the seventh is something I see a lot in clients. And that always ends up something I talk about a lot.
Yeah. Cool. So the moon in Cancer. So astrology is about the planets. Modern astrology can get really focused on the signs, which are very important, but the signs always come back to the planets. And so if you're thinking about, well, what does Cancer mean and how can I understand Cancer? You have to understand the moon because so many of the significations of Cancer are going to come from the moon. And, the moon is the archetype of the mother, the archetype of the caregiver. It's how you give care and how you like to receive care, how you nurture. The moon is the matrix of all life. She's, astronomically, she's not a planet, but in astrology, we consider the moon a planet. And
luminary.
She's a luminary. She's honestly her own category. She's more important because she has light. But she's the closest to Earth, right? And so she's the one who brings down all the other celestial energies to us and becomes the matrix through which all can manifest. And so the moon rules your body, she rules your health, she rules your emotional body. And the moon also is the fastest moving planet in the sky, right? She moves all the way through the sky in 28 days. And so the moon is constantly changing every 2.5 days to a different sign. And so wherever Cancer is in your chart, you're going to experience a lot of fluctuations, right? Sometimes the moon has a lot of light. Sometimes she's dark. Sometimes she's waxing. Sometimes she's waning. You're always kind of changing. And so if you're a Cancer rising, you're the ruler of your first house. The moon is literally moving so fast through the sky by transit that you will constantly, Lori and I were joking about that today. Like, what's my mood? What's my moon? What's my mood today based off of what the moon is doing?
And I mean, based off your chart too, I do feel like Cancer risings have tendencies to be very, I mean, that's where the emotional and all of that comes from, but almost like, I don't want to quite say bipolar, but like there's a lot of emotional ups and downs. There's a lot of like I don't know, I have really good days and then I have days where I feel kind of weird or like, there's I feel like my mood and my body change almost daily. And then when I start paying attention to where the moon is in my chart, I'm like, oh, that's why I can't see her today. So that's she's just not helping me.
And like if you have a Cancer ruled second house and the second house is the house of money and resources, then you might feel like your money really ebbs and flows. And sometimes you have a lot and sometimes you have little. You might have a very, Cancer is a water sign as well, which is our emotions and our intuition. So you might have a very emotional connection to your belongings and to your resourcing, right? And so if you have a Cancer ruled seventh house, this might be how you feel in relationship to your partners, right? So looking at whatever house is ruled by Cancer and then those topics of how this will come through.
Yeah, exactly. And also understanding that wherever your moon is in your chart and wherever Cancer is in your chart are both going to kind of do the same thing. So, especially if you're a Cancer rising, if you're ruled by the moon, paying attention to where your moon is, what it's doing, who it's interacting with, all of those
the moon phase, which we did a whole episode on phases of the moon that we can link so that because if you have a full moon in your birth chart, that'll be very different than if you have like a dark waning moon, right? So the moon, lots going on there, big stuff with Cancer, just like she's the first house in this chart.
And the moon can also be your relationship with your mom as well,
and your caregivers in general, who raised you, how were you raised.
It can tell a lot about like your birth and your mom and the way that you interact with women in general or
more femme people in general too.
Feminine energies and your relationship with those energies. It can also be like maybe how your mom shows up for you in your chart as well. So like my moon is in Aries, so it's my 10th house. And my mom is always hiring herself to work for me. It's like been a joke forever. Which is very funny when I started understanding this.
Yeah, it can be very literal.
It's very literal. But I actually did a reading for another Aries moon, Cancer rising. Um, it was a guy, and he was a Taurus, and he started a bakery with his mom.
Aw.
Him and his mom baked cakes together.
Aw. Yeah,
And I thought that was so cute.
The moon has so much to do with food as well. And like,
Yes.
what's your relationship to food? How do you nurture yourself? How do you bring resources into yourself to continue to be a physical body in this world?
And he had a Taurus stellium as well,
Mhm.
so that didn't hurt. But I thought that was so funny.
That's so sweet.
I was like, this is the most literal manifestation of this chart.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cute.
Well, should we do the sun and Leo now?
Yeah, let's move on to Leo.
Yeah. So by difference, if the moon is constantly fluctuating, constantly changing, the sun is the most steady,
Consistent.
yeah,
We
celestial
know
body.
what to expect with the sun.
The sun moves about a degree a day. Most people in modern life have, follow a solar-based calendar because it's more consistent than a lunar-based calendar. Where I was talking to my friend who's Jewish, who was talking about the Jewish calendar, and I didn't fully understand it, but like you have to add all these days at different points because like
Yeah,
the
it's
moon is so
confusing.
changeable.
Yeah.
Whereas, like a solar, the Egyptians were really big into the sun and solar philosophy, and they
Yes.
developed this really consistent, steady calendar based off of the movements of the sun.
Yeah. It's also very like matriarchy versus patriarchy as well.
Yeah, because I mean, apparently
Sun and moon.
Tibetan Buddhism or Tibetan astrology views the moon as
Yes.
masculine. So like not everyone has the same relationship with gender, but in Hellenistic astrology and a lot of Western forms of astrology, so-called West, the moon is more feminine, and the sun can signify your
The
father.
father.
But the sun is very steady and consistent. And Leo is also a fixed sign. If you're in the northern hemisphere, Leo season, it's just summer. It's just fixed. Whereas,
the biggest
to talk about something we didn't say about Cancer is that it's a cardinal sign. Cancer season starts when the sun ingresses into Cancer on the summer solstice every year. And so the cardinal signs are a lot more initiatory. They take action. Cancer is going to take action to form emotional connections as a water sign.
And it's the longest day of the year too. So the moon
in the
has
northern
the least
hemisphere.
amount of time out. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas the sun, and Leo, that's fixed. It's just like fixed summer. And so Leo is you can be very stubborn, you can be very stable, consistent. Leo, wherever you have Leo in your chart, there's like a spotlight that's being shined on that because the sun brings visibility when it rises in the sky every day. And so like I have a Leo 11th house, and I always am shining the light on community and friends because I have a Scorpio sun. So I don't really want the light on me as much as I want to like shine the light on others. Yeah, what would you say?
Yeah, so something that I actually talked about in my book a lot too is the difference between like the sun and the moon, and the sun being like the constant, it's the fate versus fortune, really, because fortune waxes and wanes like the moon, and is always changing. And something with the sun is that like a man's cycle, or a
Hormonally, a male hormonal cycle.
Male hormonal cycle is linked to the sun. So they experience everything in one day, whereas a feminine cycle,
a female hormonal cycle.
Yeah. Thank you. Is linked to the moon. So we take 28 days to have the full cycle. And so the work day, the work week was based off of a solar cycle and a masculine cycle, which obviously was created back when men were the ones who went to work. And so that's why it can be hard for women,
female body people,
yes,
people with female hormones,
yeah, to work, because we do experience these bigger fluctuations that don't just happen in one day, because a masculine body can,
or a
male body, yeah, thank you, can like go work out in the morning and
Yeah, it's like a 24-hour,
Yeah, it's
like
like it's a whole
fasting.
24-hour
Yeah,
cycle, so
fasting
you
is
can just like find different ways to work with it.
totally, like, fasting tends to be easier for male-bodied people. They tend to
Yeah.
have more energy when the days are longer than when the days are shorter, so it goes in, like, a year long, and there's more
Yeah.
sunlight, whereas female-bodied people, if it's, like, a few days before your period, if you just started your period, you're just gonna have less energy. That's, like, the
Right.
equivalent of a waning moon, and so it
Mhm.
is, like, we don't need to show up the same every day.
Yeah.
Um,
I feel that pretty extreme as well. Like my cycles are very linked to like my hunger and my energy
yeah,
levels. And
absolutely.
I've definitely had a lot of moments where like I'll go a whole week and not eat and
Yeah.
not even think twice about it.
Yeah,
It
like,
doesn't
when
even
you're
register that
like
I didn't do that.
when you're in your follicular phase, it's like you can
Mhm.
put on muscle more easily. You're less hungry,
Yeah.
you have more energy. Like, when you're ovulating, you're, like, out, and it's kind of like your full moon, you're just
Mhm.
ready to be creative and be out in the world. And then when you're in your luteal phase, it's more like maybe
Yeah.
you should be in a little bit more, like the moon is waning or you are waning. And yeah, our bodies are all different. We don't need to just show up 8 a.m. every day at work, although we do because that's how you make money to eat. But, you know, if
Yeah.
if our society was structured more on, like, the needs of life, maybe it would look a little
Right.
different than if it was structured on the needs of capital.
Right. Right.
But yeah, so sun and moon, the difference is, the sun, I think about the sun in Leo as being a very empowering sign.
Mhm.
Wherever you have Leo in your chart, you want to bring empowerment, you want to feel empowered. The sun, it signifies royalty as well. It's the
Mhm.
king. If you look at, like, wedding charts for, like, the British royal family, they always get married in the middle of the day because that's when the sun is at the
Yeah, the
top of the
sun is at
sky,
the
and it's
top.
like, kind of exalting the, like, solar royal figure. And so then there's a lot of
Mhm.
integrity and quality. Like, if you have a Leo ruled second house, if you're a Cancer rising, then
Mhm.
you're gonna want to own really nice possessions. If, Libra risings, Leo ruled 11th houses, we're gonna have really high standards with our friends and community.
Mhm.
And so thinking about solar significations and Leo connected.
Yeah. And
And
then Leo risings too, if you're ruled by your sun.
yeah, then how do
That's
you make sure you show up excellently in the
Mhm.
world? And
Yeah.
also,
Might be more particular too.
when we talk about sun sign astrology, right, that's one of the first things people know is like, oh, where's your sun? If you're a
Mhm.
Leo, then you have your
Yeah,
sun in
you
domicile. Like,
know.
you already know. Because if I tell you I'm a Scorpio, then it's like, well, where's your Mars, right? Because there's 12 different flavors of how your Scorpio can show up. But if your sun's in Leo, you have strong Leo energy coming through.
Yes. Yeah.
Cool. Should we talk about both of the Mercury signs together?
Yeah.
So this doesn't become like 4 hours.
Yeah.
Cool. So then you have Mercury in Virgo, and then you also have Mercury ruling Gemini. And so maybe just to start by talking, Mercury significations are all over the place. Like, if you read Valens, who's an ancient
Mhm.
Hellenistic astrologer, and you read, like, his lists of what the planets signify, like,
Mhm.
Mercury's is like a giant paragraph, right?
It's
But the
everything.
summaries, because Mercury's changeable, like, Mercury is super non-binary, is super queer, cannot be pinned into boxes. And so it's like Mercury has to do with writing, communication, language, how we connect with each other. You can think about, like, merchants and mercantilism and
Mhm.
markets and commerce, travel, logistics. In Greek mythology, Hermes, who is the congruent deity of Mercury, Hermes was one of the only gods that could travel between worlds, and
Mhm.
tonic
In the
Hermes
realm.
was the one who would lead you to the underworld. So strong Mercury energy, like, we did an asteroid underworld stories podcast where we talk about how there's all these significations of how my chart connects back to the underworld. And part of it is that I have Mercury conjunct the ascendant, like Mercury is an underworld god. But one who travels between worlds, they don't just stay underground. Mercury signifies youth and young people and learning,
Mhm.
words.
Yeah. The brain, the
Yeah.
mind, your communication style. Um, in synastry, I think Mercury is a big one to see how you communicate with
Mhm.
others.
Yeah, like, we have our Mercuries trying each other in air signs, and we
So we have a
have a
lot to say.
podcast together.
Yep.
Wow.
Wow. But yeah, I've actually really noticed that I attract a lot of clients and friends who have their Mercury in either a air or fire sign. I've also noticed that like having an air Mercury or a fire Mercury can be more externally processy.
Yeah,
Like I don't have a single thought in my head sometimes until I say it out loud, and then
literally.
then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I didn't know I thought that. So yeah, like speaking externally is really healthy for those energies. And leaning into that, actually, the biggest difference that I talk about a lot, moving back into that similar metaphor, is that when you think about Virgo and Gemini being the two Mercury ruled signs, I think about Mercury in Virgo being the internal, like stuck inside Mercury, can't
Because
get out. It's
Virgo's ruled,
inside of it.
Virgo is Earth,
It's
right? Earth
Earth.
is
Yeah,
very
it's
internal,
very
very
stuck.
weighted down.
And so if you have Virgo placements, or especially Mercury and Virgo, you're going to internalize things. You're going to think about it. You're going to overthink. You might develop OCD, or you might overthink things. You might over analyze. You might
You constantly want to make things perfect. You're always
yeah,
improving them.
detailing and constantly nitpicking, and yeah, just like trying to make sure everything is like very good till you develop some stomach issues.
Yeah, 'cause Virgo in medical astrology rules the gut and the
Mhm.
small intestine.
Yeah, so it literally like goes into the gut. So I always tell Virgo placements, especially, like you need to just listen to your gut and
Hmm.
then act and then speak and then do, because that's going to be really important so you don't internalize too much. Whereas Gemini is the opposite. It's the word vomit. It's the
Because
outside
that's
of
the air
Mercury.
sign Mercury,
It's
right?
bouncing
If you
around.
like look at air, if you light incense, right, it's going everywhere. It's moving upwards and outwards in a
Hmm.
way. It's here, there. Gemini season in the northern hemisphere is when all the pollinators are out and they're here and they're there and they're connecting, but they're not staying anywhere very long.
Right, right. Yeah. So it's very movable, it's very changeable. And yeah, Mercury and Gemini is going to be very external.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's something big that I've noticed a lot, is just that yeah, and that's something that's so easy too. Like air and fire Mercury's need to externally process, and water and earth Mercury's tend to internalize a little bit more.
Yeah, and the medieval astrologers categorized water Mercuries as mute because you can't talk under water. So if you have Mercury in a
Mhm.
water sign, depending if you have Mercury conjunct the ascendant and it's joy, it's gonna like be out there no matter what. But
Sure.
Mercury in a water sign, it might be harder to. And I always love asking people like, "What do you think in?" Because like I think in words, but a lot
Mhm.
of my friends with Mercury and Pisces and Sag, right? Mercury and detriment, they always tell me they think in pictures or sounds, or
Mhm.
like you have to translate to bring the words, whereas my air sign Mercury, it's like
Yeah.
the words are already there.
I attract a lot of Pisces Mercuries specifically in my life, and I've noticed that I almost have to like talk in poetry or like
Hmm.
write them letters to communicate. Because if you like approach a Pisces Mercury and you're like, "Hey, what do you think about this?" They're gonna be like, "Oh no," and
What
so
do I think?
I don't know.
Do I
What is that?
think?
And yeah, so I just found that like the best way to communicate was to just write a letter or something. And
Hmm.
we can talk more about that in the detriment episode.
Yeah.
But um yeah, so water can definitely
Slow down. You
mute
pour
or
water and it goes into the earth, right? It's much more internal than like you
mhm,
light a candle and it goes up.
yeah.
The other thing, so we already covered Gemini is air sign, Virgo is earth sign. They're both ruled by Mercury. And they're also both mutable signs. So you think about Gemini season in the northern hemisphere, it's like, is it spring? Is it summer? Do I need a jacket? Is it hot? Is it cold? Like, I don't know. It's changing every day. And same with Virgo season
Mhm,
and, late August, early September. Like, is it summer? Is it fall? And even in the southern hemisphere, it's still shifting between seasons, just opposite seasons. And so mutable
mhm,
signs tend to be a lot more flexible and changeable. That very much fits the nature of Mercury, who doesn't, like, literally in the sky astronomically, Mercury gets into nooks and crannies of the sky that no other planet
mhm,
does, especially during their retrograde cycle, which Mercury retrogrades more than like more often than any other planet.
Yeah.
So that's one reason we're talking about Mercury retrograde so much, is because they're happening three times
This
a year.
happens a lot.
And when Mercury retrogrades, it appears as though they're just like, they're mischievous, right? Mercury is also the trickster, right? If you have a lot of Mercury ruled planets, then you might just be a little mischievous. Like, what is truth? You might enjoy lying. I knew someone with some kind of gnarly Mercury placements who loved to like pick locks and change locks and stuff, you know? So it's like
Yeah.
Mercury can get kind of mischievous. Like Venus and Jupiter are considered benefic helping planets. And depending on different lineages of astrology, like, and different conditions of Mercury, your Mercury may or may not be malefic or benefic. Like Mercury can be kind of a tough planet sometimes. And also when you have a planet in its own sign, that means like you're kind of this vessel for the pure energy of the gods to work through you. And so if you have Mercury in Gemini or Virgo, like you're going to have a very strong mind, which might make you very successful in some ways, but like Lori already said, may cause like overthinking or like insomnia from not being able to turn off your mind, or like this pressure that now you have to be this super successful computer programmer because language is so good for you, you know, and like it can be a lot.
A lot of Gemini Mercuries, I feel like, put a lot of pressure on themselves to say the right things. Or yeah, they feel like they have to be like right about things. But I also know a lot of people with Gemini Mercury who like just love to gossip. They just want the tea. They want the details. They want knowledge. They want to know stuff. And so it doesn't really even matter what it is. And so yeah, I think it can go both extremes.
Yeah.
Pretty often.
And then one last thing about Mercury. Mercury is currently in Gemini, I might add. And there's like so much, it's like a Gemini stellium right now. And we're like, oh, Mercury. Like, of course, we have so much to say. But Mercury is like a very small planet who gets into all these nooks and crannies. And so the nature of Mercury is to want to break things down and look at them very close up. Like literally Virgo and Mercury rule the small intestine, like the part of your body that breaks things down, that processes things. And so it's like, if you have a lot of Gemini or Virgo placements or a very strong Mercury, you may really want to look at the small details of things, as opposed to when we get to Jupiter, the planet who squares and opposes Gemini, Mercury signs, and Jupiter is this like big gas body. Like Jupiter wants to look at the big picture, right? And so Mercury, when Mercury is in its own sign, it can really break things down and look at things very close. Whereas if Mercury is in Sagittarius or Pisces, it's like having to deal with this big meaning making, when Mercury really wants to like analyze every little detail.
Yeah, that's so true too. And one last thing I do want to say about Mercury.
Or Mercury wants to say us to say for them.
Mercury wants to talk. Well, and I personally have my Mercury, it's only 3 degrees away from my sun, so it's under the beams. And that's very, very common for people to have Mercury under the beams.
Because Mercury never gets very far from the sun. So a lot of times Mercury is literally invisible because they're so close to the sun.
Yeah, so it's actually like pretty uncommon that you have a Mercury placement that is able to like stand on its own, because any planet that's within 15 degrees of the sun is going to be under the beams, because when you think about it, when you think about it, you look up in the sky, you're gonna see the sun. Like you're not gonna see any other planet. You're gonna see the sun.
But if the planet's close to the sun, then they're below the horizon at night.
Right. So you're not going to see them if they're conjunct the sun or if they're closer to the sun, whereas other planets aren't going to do that same thing. And so since Mercury is usually very close to it, it gets lost a lot of times, where it doesn't really able to have its own voice away from the sun, whereas Mercury can only be one sign away if it's not in the same sign as your sun. And so those people tend to, oftentimes not agree with their sun sign, or relate so much to their sun sign, because it feels like their sun and their Mercury are their blind spots to each other now. And so they can't communicate, they can't see each other. And so there's a lot of like, basically you almost have one or the other. It's pretty rare that I see Mercury and the sun in the same sign but far enough away from each other that they're not
would be possible
hidden. It's possible, but I don't see it often.
Well, and also like Mercury doesn't necessarily want to be seen. Like some of Mercury's more trickster
true
energy.
too.
Mercury rules
Yeah.
thieves and lockpicks and different things like that as well. And so sometimes it's nice to be invisible. Like sometimes
Yeah.
it's nice to not be seen depending on what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And Mercury does a lot better with being combust and invisible than some of the other planets because Mercury,
He's used to it.
yeah, one of their significations literally is like the messenger for the king, right? Like Mercury's tethered to the sun. And
Right.
so Mercury's doing the work of the sun a lot of times.
Yeah, it's kind of just orbiting and trying to process and trying to take some of the load away. And
Hmm.
yeah, so thinking of it in that way.
Great. Should we talk about Venus?
We shall.
Okay. So then you
Not
got
me.
you got Venus ruling Libra and then Venus ruling Taurus.
Mhm.
And so Taurus is a fixed earth sign and that's
Mhm.
how Venus will come through, whereas Libra is an air sign and is another cardinal sign. So Libra season in the northern hemisphere is the fall equinox and it marks, when day and night are equal lengths regardless of where you are in the world. And then if
Mhm.
you're in the northern hemisphere, the sun is now losing light and moving towards the solstice. And so Libra season initiates fall, and Libra, being ruled by Venus and an air sign, initiates social connection and intellectual stimulation and beauty and art. Whereas Taurus is more this like fixed, earthy, lush garden energy that Venus comes through.
Yeah. Yeah, and in the northern hemisphere too, those are the two prettiest times of the
Literally.
year because Venus in Taurus, like Taurus season is the middle of spring. So that's when all of the plants are bloomed and the flowers are out and
Mm-hmm.
all the pretty things are happening. And then the opposite, that Libra energy is when the leaves are falling
Yeah,
and
they're
we have all
changing
the
color in the
colors and
fall.
yeah. And so I always think of the Venus signs as like very Venusian in theme by itself. Like it just is the prettiest time.
Literally.
Yeah, it's that energy of just like beauty.
And so, yeah, Venus's significations are beauty, aesthetics, art. Venus wants to bring things together. Kelly Surtees uses the analogy of baking and when you put the liquids in and it brings
Mhm.
all the dry things together. Like Venus is this connective, magnetic energy. Venus is a very social planet. Whatever Venus is doing in your chart will signify how you relate to others, how you connect with others. And, as an animist, as someone who sees aliveness in everything, not just, humans and animals and things, it's like, how do I connect with the sun? How do I literally connect with Venus, the planet? How do I connect with the land I'm on? How do I connect with Lori? Like my Venus placement
Mhm.
and the planet and the signs in my chart ruled by Venus will have a lot to say about that. Venus also loves pleasure and relaxation and leisure. Like Venus and Mars are the two very sexual planets, and Mars is much more like having sex, whereas Venus is like the sensual, connected attraction, desire, and desire in general, even beyond sexual desire. Venus, like what are your desires, will be indicated
Mhm.
by what Venus is doing in your chart. And so then those sorts of significations come through Taurus and Libra, where you see a lot of artists and musicians, especially like Taurus rules the throat. So you see a lot of singers.
Mhm.
I always use Beyonce as an example of Libra incarnate. She has like Venus and Libra conjunct the ascendant. She also has like
Mhm.
Mercury and Jupiter and Saturn, like all in Libra, and
Yeah.
Beyonce is just this incredible artist who has like such a feel for culture and is like shaping and
Mhm.
pushing culture. And yeah, Venus is like our social rules and how we kind of enforce social rules among each other as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and the justice system and
Mm-hmm.
something that big we talked about in our in the episode with Lila with the justice and the sixes
Mm-hmm.
and all those things was that story of Inanna and the big difference between Venus being in Taurus, which is more feminine energy, it's more beauty, it's more laid back, it's more passive, whereas in a masculine air sign Venus, does have the ability to kind of go both ways. And that conversation we had about, Mars is going to do violence because Mars wants to do violence, but Venus can do violence if provoked,
Mm-hmm.
if it needs to, if it feels like it has to fight the fight for something, it's going to fight the fight, but it's not going to fight because it feels like it. It's going to fight because there's justice and there's
Yeah.
truth
Or
involved.
for society. Like
Right.
Alice Sparkley Cat in post-colonial astrology talks a lot about Venus and how Venus was one of the main, or yeah, I guess Venus would be the Roman version, one of the main goddesses to ancient Rome. You know, this
Yeah.
incredibly imperialistic, militaristic, violent society who like had Venus at the center of their cultural practices, because you like create violence to have civilization and to have space for more civilization. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, Venus can definitely, but she does it in a lot more like hidden of ways than Mars is a little more explicit in his violence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mars
Yeah.
is just gonna do it because.
And so yeah, Venus like as a Taurus rising, I'm not a Taurus rising. As a Libra rising, like I'm a very social person. I'm a person who always wants to feel connected with others, who wants to seek out beauty and aesthetically pleasing things. And then also, especially with my Venus in Scorpio, who, you know, is handed a gun, even though she'd rather like give someone a hug. You know, she's in Mars's sign, so she is kind of given more of a like punchy energy. It's like I am so big on justice and fighting for social justice, being like a queer person who wants to like, you know, change everything to make this world a safe place for queer and trans people and people of color and immigrants and like all of those of us who live on the margins. You know, it's like that sort of stuff. I also have Jupiter and Sag, so I can get pretty political, but it's like fighting for justice, fighting for balance and equality, right? Libra is the scales. Libra is also the only sign that's a machine rather than like an animal or a human, which is an animal. But Libra is literally a machine. It's the scales. It's like, how do you find balance?
Yeah.
And it makes me think of the like there can be no peace without justice, the bell hooks quote. Like you need justice, like no justice, no peace, right? We chant that at protests, right? Like to have peace, to have tranquility, which is what Venus wants, like you need to have justice. You can't just be like, oh yeah, we're gonna forget that that atrocity happened and move on. It's like, no, you need justice for things when they go wrong. And I think that that's a really, you know, and bringing up Inanna, right, the ancient Babylonian goddess who was associated with the planet Venus. You know, she was both a goddess of war and a goddess of love, right? So you do have to fight to protect that which you love.
Yeah, absolutely. And another signification of Venus too can be like money and like bringing wealth or bringing abundance into your life. Or like trade, or like what do you value? What do you have of value? That can get you whatever. Because money is more of a modern thing. Back when a lot of these significations were created, they didn't have the systems that we currently have. So, things have had to change and shift in more of a modern sense. And so that's a big thing with Venus as well. It can be like how you bring money into your life. Or I look at Venus a lot when I do career readings for people, because it's like, well, what do you love? Like, what do you love to do? What do you want to do? Like, let's lean into that.
What brings you pleasure?
Right, because that's ultimately going to allow yourself to open up and attract more money into your life.
Yeah, because
right?
Venus is that magnetic,
attraction.
that like letting things come to you.
Right.
Unless you have Venus in a Mars ruled sign.
Right.
But like
Well, sure.
generally Venus is magnetizing things to herself. I guess she's doing that always.
Yeah.
Mars ruled Venuses are gonna want to go for it a little more than other Venuses might.
Sure. But yeah, that's something I think about a lot, because it's not like Venus rules money, but it does rule the attraction and the love and the passion behind what you do. And so if you can find the thing that you love the most, well, then why wouldn't you do that to attract whatever the currency is wherever you're living or wherever you are? And like trading and just all of.
And Venus also very literally can signify women and femmes. And like whatever is happening by transit with Venus in the sky can say a lot about like the progression or regression of women's rights. And then Venus also just deals with our sexuality regardless of what our sexuality is, you know. And so yeah, just tying this all back to then if you have Venus in her own sign of either Taurus or Libra, those sorts of significations are going to come through a lot stronger for you. And then regardless,
you're probably going to have less questioning of like sexuality
well, not
or
necessarily, because
yeah, I
there
guess
could
it
be
depends on the
aspects and
whole
other
chart.
things, but like
Yeah.
Venus in Taurus could be an incredible artist or an incredible baker
Right.
or just really good at having a lot of community around them, you know, depending on where Taurus is in your chart.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and then wherever Libra and Taurus are in your chart, looking at where your Venus is to how that influences what's going on there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And how whatever area of life it can really pull those significations out from.
And Venus is a helper. She's a benefic planet, so she wants to do
Mhm.
good. She wants to say yes. She wants to bring in joy and pleasure and good things, especially of like a very like being of the night sect. It's much more
Yeah.
of like this kind of sensual, physical way that Venus brings things in, whereas Jupiter in the day sect brings things in more through like spirit and like
Yeah.
these kind of more external things. And so even if you have Venus in detriment or difficult Venus aspects, like she's always trying to help. The amount of help she's able to give may be more or less available depending on. And if you have Venus in her own sign, unless there's a really difficult aspect limiting that, then Venus will be able to bring about more help for you. And especially people born at nighttime, Venus is then your insect benefic. We have a whole podcast episode about sect you can go look up if you want to learn more about that.
Yeah.
But then like what Venus is doing becomes even more important because she is your biggest helper in your chart for those of us born at night.
Yeah.
Mars?
Mars.
You want to go with Mars? I feel like I've been starting with all of them.
Sure. I am Mars.
Yeah, Mars the ascendant.
Yeah. Aries moon. Yeah. I have a lot to say about Mars. Mars is action, it's movement, it's violence, it's always trying to bring about something. It's not necessarily like pretty, but it's strong and it's there. I make that joke a lot actually with circus stuff. Because I'm not necessarily the most graceful person in the world, but I can do all the like strongman stuff. Like I can do the like hard things, but like don't expect me to point both of my toes. Like
Yeah, that would be the Venus people.
Right.
Who would be all pretty
that's
about
for
it.
them. I'm not gonna make it pretty. I'm gonna just do it. Yeah, so Mars is gonna be that like that strength and the action.
Yeah, and then Mars rules Scorpio, which is a fixed water sign. And then Mars also rules Aries, which is a fire cardinal sign. And so if you have Mars in Scorpio or Aries, you're going to be a workhorse. You're going to be really good at getting things done and taking action, being decisive, making things happen. Aries is like the match. So it's like you light it and then it goes out. So Aries can be a bit more like quick. Oh gosh, the way that Zoom like tracks your hands is so creepy.
I was wondering what that was.
Oh my goodness.
That was wild.
But yeah, so Mars and Aries will be like quick impulsive actions, but then you might like need a nap afterwards, whereas Mars and Scorpio is like it's more internal, right? Again, like we said, like fire moves upwards, water moves downwards. And so Mars and Scorpio is like the person who's been like plotting and stewing for years and then comes out and it's like created this like masterful body of work.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, on TikTok I get a lot of Taylor Swift videos.
Yeah, like Taylor Swift has Mars and Scorpio, and like how much
Scorpio.
has she accomplished over the years with
Well,
her effort.
A joke that I see a lot on TikTok is people talking about how she's never gotten over a single thing in her entire life.
Because Scorpio it's fixed water. It will hold on to that emotion. As someone with a lot of Scorpio placements, like, yeah, I don't, like, my feelings will be hurt for a long time, and I would like to work on that, but, like,
Yeah.
I will hold a grudge just naturally, because
Yeah.
that Scorpio
Well,
holds
and
on.
it'll come back up years later. It'll be like, oh, and also, remember when you did this? Whereas Mars and Aries is gonna be like, already forgotten.
Like really angry for a little bit, and then they're like, I took a nap, and what was I mad about?
That's how I am. Yeah. I forget in 10, 20 minutes.
Mars is also, you know, if Venus is the principle of coming together, Mars is the principle of separation. So Mars wants to sever, wants to create clear delineations between things. So when you have a strong Mars, or if you have a lot of Mars placements, like I have a lot of planets in Scorpio, Lori's ascendant rulers in Aries, then you can have you might be a little bit better at like individuating yourself or really making sure to meet your needs, even if that might not be as good for relationships at certain points, whereas someone with a lot of Venus ruled stuff might be a lot better at relating to others, but might struggle at like being assertively independent at different points. So that's kind of the push and pull, right? Like Venus and Mars oppose each other. Libra and Aries are doing very opposite things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very much like, well, and especially when you look at Aries and Libra, that opposition is very like me versus you. It
Mm-hmm.
can be very like independent. I mean, and even like my Aries is so strong, it's that like hyper independence that comes out a lot where it's like, I don't need anybody, I don't need help. And then having to ask for help is a big Aries lesson, big
Yeah,
Aries life lesson.
very well.
But then Libra can be very people pleasing.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it can put people above themselves a
Mm-hmm.
little too much. And so Mars and Venus can be that way as well, where it's like Mars just wants to act and it doesn't necessarily think first. There's definitely been moments, or even in my own life that I've noticed where I'll just do something and I'm not really thinking about it, but I'm like, oh, this needs to get done, so I just will do it. And I'll be like, oh, that was maybe rude, or like maybe
Yeah.
I shouldn't have like, you think about it later and you're like, oh, I didn't even think to whatever it was. And whereas like Libra's gonna almost like think too much. Like they're gonna be like
Which is why
that
Libras can
Venus,
then be like indecisive, is because they're considering what everyone wants
too
so
many
much if they're
other
looking at all the
choices.
options.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
Mars is just gonna, oh, it's already done.
And
Needs to
Mars,
get done. It's done.
yeah. Yeah. And Mars has a lot to do with like physical energy and activity. And so, like,
Yes.
if you have a really strong Mars, a really active Mars, like exercise, literally find good channels for that
Yeah.
Mars energy so that you're not unintentionally becoming violent. It's like we
Yeah.
all do deal with violence and aggression in different ways in this world. And
Yeah.
if you deal with a lot of those Mars like energies, go for a run, like have sex, do something very Martian that's not harmful to like get that energy through. Um, yeah, and Mars can do a lot with like athletes and athleticism. So can Mercury,
Mhm.
actually, because Mercury had a lot to do with like young men in the gym in ancient Greece. So Mars and Mercury
Yeah.
both, if you have strong planets or aspects between them, can signify great athleticism.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, my Mars being on the ascendant as well in a mutual reception to my moon chart ruler on my MC. Um, they are very loud, and I've had people joke my whole life that like I'm the Energizer Bunny, like I don't
Mm,
sleep, I don't, I constantly have this energy, I'm constantly moving, I'm constantly doing, I'm constantly creating. And for me, it's just like, well, yeah, I had a thought, I had an idea, I just did it. Like, here it is. Here's my
yeah,
finished project.
Mars can be very
Um,
impulsive,
very impulsive. I live on my
depending
Mars
on where
line too.
Mars is. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly that too. So, Mars also rules my fifth house, which is
yeah.
my creative space as well. So, those two things definitely work together a lot. But
And
Mars is
then
definitely energy levels.
yes, and how much energy do you have?
Yeah.
And Mars is a malefic planet, so while Venus wants to say yes and be helpful, Mars wants to say no, and Mars signifies things
Mhm.
that can be contrary to conditions of life, right? Like violence, aggression, war. Those things don't necessarily
Mhm.
facilitate life. Accidents, right? Mars has to do with accidents, injuries, being burnt, being stabbed. Like these are not nice things. And so Mars can bring up more difficulty. Mars requires a lot of effort when you're working with Mars energy, and you can be rewarded depending on, how strong your Mars is and all of that. But wherever Aries and Scorpio are in your chart can signify places in your life where you might have to exert more effort or difficult, or like things might be more difficult, or you might hear no more. Whereas where Venus ruled signs in your chart are, you might hear yes more. So that is all. And if you were born at day, Mars is then your out of sect
Difficult.
malefic and is even more difficult because it said the heat of the day heats up Mars's heat. And so especially those of you guys born during daytime, being aware that like watch your temper, manage your things, don't like use an oven mitt. That's like
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Don't get too impulsive when you're
Yeah.
doing little things. They're like, yeah,
Yeah. Jupiter?
Jupiter.
Cool. So then we have Jupiter ruling Sagittarius and Jupiter ruling Pisces. I have Jupiter in Sag. It's my only planet in domicile. And so like I had said earlier, Jupiter astronomically is this big gaseous planet. Like there's literally no like borders or boundaries of Jupiter. It just like goes and goes and goes. And it's the biggest planet in the solar system, I believe. Is Neptune bigger? Jupiter is one of the biggest planets, if not the biggest planet.
Yeah.
And so Jupiter makes things really big. Jupiter expands things. Jupiter is a benefic planet who says yes and wants to help, especially for people born during the day. Jupiter can be especially helpful. But Jupiter is just, it is very optimistic. Jupiter wants to make meaning out of things. And so when you have Jupiter in Sag, that is a mutable fire sign. And then Jupiter in Pisces is a mutable water sign. So Jupiter in Sag is going to be a lot more like action taking, impulsive. You know, you think of like wild horses or centaurs just running across the open earth, or like a wildfire would be Sag. You know, it's like this fire that just like takes up so much land and goes and goes and goes, right? Sag can have a lot to do with exploring and travel and adventure. I have my Mars and Jupiter in Sag, and I need to ski, I need to run, I need to exercise, I need to like get all my energy out. But Sag also, you know, it's Christmas season. So it's like larger than life, like pleasurable, enjoyable, like let's decorate. Jupiter's very generous and giving, you know, like let's give gifts, let's donate money, let's do all this stuff. But it can be unsustainable when it's unmitigated, right? Like growth without limitations becomes cancerous, literally, right? And so you have, you know, Sagittarius season all through Christmas, and then you actually get to Christmas and you get to Capricorn season, and Saturn's like, okay, but how are we gonna eat and survive for the rest of winter? You know, whereas Jupiter is like, let's just drink and eat. And, you know, so Jupiter, like Santa is the most Jupiterian, Sagittarian type of energy, literally. Whereas in Pisces, Jupiter's are going to be very like compassionate and emotionally attuned and very emotionally generous and a lot more quiet and tender because it is that water sign, but very, very philosophical, very, very wise. Like Jupiter just really wants to make meaning out of things, wants to find optimism, wants to look at the big picture.
Yeah. Yeah. My Jupiter's not very prominent and I don't talk about it very often. So
yeah, you do have Jupiter in its own terms though, which we'll make an episode about what it means to have a planet in its own terms. It's minor dignity, but Jupiter is also teachers. Lori's, you know, she's a teacher. You have a Jupiter ruled MC, so your career.
I do. That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Jupiter is definitely a lot of knowledge. It's soaking in, it's bringing in, it's overindulgence.
Literally. Yeah, Jupiter can just be too much.
Too much of a good thing, too much of a bad thing. I always just basically say that Jupiter expands whatever it touches.
Literally.
So, you know, when people get really overhyped on the TikTok about like the Jupiter Uranus conjunction that just happened, or like other things like that. You know, Jupiter's just expanding the energy of whatever other planet it's touching. And so with Uranus, like that's sudden and unconventional and random, and you know, like who knows what that's going to manifest as. It could be good or it could be bad. And so yeah, I always see Jupiter transits as well, like it is luck and abundance, it is good things, but it can also bring difficult things. It can also bring just a lot of something.
And I always say, like, Jupiter will bring opportunities, but if you don't have a container, if you don't have the Saturn energy to capture those opportunities, a Jupiter transit could actually be incredibly difficult because you might like have all this hopeful stuff happen, and then at the end, like I always say, transitioning from Sagittarius to Capricorn is like falling off the precipice of a cliff. Like you're in Sagittarius, and you're like, yes, yes, what if? Like I'm so optimistic and hopeful, and then you like fall both. Like both Sag and Capricorn also have mountain significations, so it's like then you transition to Capricorn and Saturn's like, okay, but what's your business plan? Like what's the like actual
but how
like
is this actually gonna work?
Yeah, and then you like fall off the cliff, you know. So it's like Jupiter can feel really good, but if you're not rooted in reality, like you could just like eat too much and make yourself sick, right? You can drink like Jupiter I have a lot of Pisces, I have a lot of Sag, you know, people close to me have a lot of Jupiter placements, and it can be like partying too much, drinking too much, overindulgence in that way, like being addicted to weed, like
Yeah,
there's
I was
things
gonna
that could
say
cause
addiction is a
Pisces especially.
big, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
Pisces tends to go more the drug and disassociation route. Um, but yeah, Jupiter can definitely be an overindulgence and a addictive tendency, especially when I see Jupiter in like the eighth or 12th house.
Mm.
I see that manifest a lot as like some sort of addiction or addictive tendencies or attracting people with addiction sometimes.
Being overly generous, or like especially
Yeah, being
Jupiter
too
squares
much.
could be like you're generous
Mm,
and other people in your life are not generous back to you.
yeah, too
So,
giving,
uh-huh.
too willing to spend, too willing to,
Yeah. So when you
yeah.
have Jupiter in its own sign, like you might be really good at feeling hopeful, feeling optimistic, being philosophical, making meaning. You know, Jupiter can be quite political. You might be successful in politics or
Mhm.
religion. You know, you might just be really good at like being expansive and abundant and generous, but then being aware that, especially depending on what else is going on in your chart, like
Yeah.
that can sometimes be too much. And understanding when you have a very strong Jupiter, again, like I was saying with Mercury and with all of these planets, like when you have a planet in its own sign, you then become a vessel for like kind of almost a pure version of this
Yeah.
planet to come through you. And like that's the power of the gods coming through like a mere mortal, you know? So knowing how to manage, and like Jupiter and Saturn work pretty well together. If anyone works well with Saturn, it would be Jupiter, but still Saturn's difficult. And so it's like having that balance of like growth and contraction and expansion and containers, and like bringing in more Saturn energy
Yeah.
can help to, you know, like let's let things grow. Like Jupiter's incredibly life affirming, but like
Mhm.
again, like if you don't limit your growth, you can get negative things that come from that.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a great way of saying that too. It definitely can be, yeah, unable to contain, unable to stop.
Yeah.
Um,
But then also, you know, if you have like a lot of planets ruled by Venus or ruled by Jupiter, ruled by these benefics, those planets, depending on the condition of Venus and Jupiter in your chart, but those planets are going to have a lot nicer of a landlord, right? Like Jupiter
true.
placements, like Pisces and Sag placements, like that's a lot nicer of a teacher. You know, that's like the teacher who like is like, oh, I'll give you extra credit, or you guys can have a pizza party on Friday or whatever. Whereas like Mars and Saturn are the like you're going to detention type teachers.
Yeah.
So should we
True.
talk about Saturn?
Let's talk about Saturn.
I'll let you take that one.
I am Saturn. Yeah, so Saturn is going to be Capricorn and Aquarius, and the final ends, the opposite of the luminaries. And so Saturn is structure.
Mhm.
It's like it is the container that it needs to be put into. Um, in like I was talking about at the beginning, I see Capricorn, that fig or the cardinal earth, the earth in general, just being the inside of Saturn. Like it's trying to uphold the structure. It's trying to keep things the way that they are. It's trying to swear that the way things used to be done are the way that things always should be done, right? Like how things should not change. Things should have their almost like to the book, like this is how it is. And Saturn takes a really long time to create and to bring its significations about. Um, Whereas Aquarius is kind of that external, it's the air around it. And so it likes a little bit more of that change, but it's like how can we bring the community, the collective sides of all of this together and like, unify everybody. And Saturn rewards hard work. It's
Yes.
how I always see it. It's
Depending on your Saturn placement, if you have a really difficult Saturn, you might not get
yeah,
that much reward, but
you'll still get some
you
reward.
will get something for it. Yes.
Yeah, like basically Saturn is like it's work, it's your life lesson, it's structure,
Effort.
it's effort, it's things that are gonna be a little bit slower. It's the areas of life that they're not gonna happen right away. They are gonna take more work. They are gonna be a later in life thing. They're not gonna happen before 30. Um but once you start working through those Saturnian lessons, Saturn can really dignify itself. Saturn can give a lot back. So I do notice that very Saturnian people do tend to have more difficult lives in their early childhood. And then, things start to get easier and better for them as they age. I always compare Capricorn to like Benjamin Button energy, like a really serious child, like born an 80-year-old man kind of energy. But then like as they age, they become a little more like chaotic and childlike because they start to like loosen the grip and they start to realize like, oh, I like actually don't have to act like this. And Saturn placements more often than not had to raise themselves in childhood in some way, especially like Capricorn sun and moon. Aquarius can be a similar energy, but Capricorn I do see a little more extreme of this. But it's very like strict and structured and like a very serious child. But there usually is a moment with Capricorn where they're like, I actually want to run away, or like, that Capricorn friend who surprises you when they get a little older and they're like, actually, I'm quitting my job and I'm running off with the circus, whatever. And it's like, oh, okay.
Capricorn is work hard, play hard. I feel like Capricorns can party really hard, but they like were at work for 80 hours in the week before they went and then it's like got lit.
Well, and tying in tarot to this, which we want to do some tarot episodes as well. I pulled the devil this morning, so that's why I was like, oh, let's talk about that. The devil card to me is very much like it is kind of a Jupiterian energy. It's like overdoing it. But there's like a thing with Capricorn that they create this like vice for themselves, that work hard, play hard. Like it's usually like, okay, I'm gonna work really, really hard, but then why am I living? Right? They have this question of like, well, now what? And so that's kind of where that devil energy comes in tarot. Is like, oh, I like can't keep doing things the way that I'm doing things. So how about instead I just extreme out and I'm gonna go. It's like very functioning alcoholic energy. Like you would never know that this person is like drinking vodka out of a water bottle all day, but like they can't function without it. Like what would happen if they stopped, right? They would go fully into withdrawal. And so yeah, it's like almost learning how to live with or work with this weird structures that you've created for yourself.
Yeah. Well, and Saturn is the slowest moving of the visible planets, right? Saturn takes about 28 years to complete her entire rotation around the sky. That's why you have your Saturn return in your late 20s, is like I'm currently in my Saturn return as I recover from knee surgery. And gosh, but it's like Saturn has not returned to the place in the sky where she was when I was born until now that I'm 28 years old. And so that's one reason why Lori says like Saturn things can be slower, can take longer to signify, especially around 30, right? And wherever Capricorn and Aquarius are in your chart, those topics will become a lot more available to you once you have completed your first Saturn return and learned more of Saturn's lessons. And Saturn, like especially Capricorn energy, I think of as the mountain goat. You take one step and then you take another step and you take another step and eventually you're at the top of the mountain, right? Like slow, concerted, consistent effort gets results is the lesson of Capricorn. And so yeah, Saturn, you just show up every day, you keep working, you keep grinding, and eventually you will have built something. Saturn's very like structural, and how do you construct things? And Saturn will be building something in your life regardless. I mean, like a few years ago, I like during a Venus retrograde, I just like stayed home all winter and played Animal Crossing, and I got to the end and I'd like done all the like little side quest things, and I was like, I hate this island that I've built. Like I had just been building it like haphazardly, and at the end I'm like, what have I built? Like I don't even like this, and I feel like that can be Saturn if you're not intentional. Like you're building something and then you like take a step back because you didn't have a broader image of what you were building, and you're like, what is this? And sometimes Saturn things can be like also a wrecking ball to rebuild, right? Saturn
Yeah.
can bring really, like, I'm literally getting I'm recovering from ACL reconstruction surgery. Like, that is, Saturn rules the knees, Capricorn rules the knees, but also like I am reconstructing my
Yeah.
ligament in this moment.
Well, and so something I notice a lot in my readings, I attract a lot of people who are right in the middle of some sort of Saturn cycle, and Saturn cycles are what I studied originally. That's what I was first drawn to in astrology, because first of all, I have an Aquarius stellium and I'm obsessed, and a Capricorn descendant. But I'm so fascinated by how Saturn will manifest in people's lives. And something that I see a lot is whenever people are telling me about an injury or an accident or something that threw them off course in their life, or they start telling me about this time they had to get surgery or this thing that happened to them or something that happened with their body, I always first thing will ask, oh, well, how old were you? And they were always in a Saturn cycle, which happens in 7-year increments. And every single time they were 14, or they were 21, or they were 28, 29, they were 36, they were 42. Like, they're always in a Saturn cycle, give or take a year on either side, right? Because Saturn takes about 3 years. And it's just so funny to me how, like, Saturn will be like, oh, you're actually not playing my game. I want you to stop doing what you're doing. So here's a knee surgery, right? Like,
Yeah.
here's an injury, here's an accident, here's the thing that's gonna put you on your correct path. And something that, like, I talk about a lot with my Saturn return, because I have a very dignified Saturn. Mine is in Aquarius. It's in domicile. It's with my Sun and Mercury. It's in my 8th house, and I have a day chart. Um, Saturn's pretty happy in my chart, and for me, when I was 27, I started having panic attacks about hurting my body, about injuring myself in acro or whatever. I started having these crazy dreams, and I always have had premonition like dreams that tell me things. And I started having these really intense dreams of me hurting myself and not having my body anymore. And then what would my Mars moon situation do if I wasn't able to still move and still incorporate movement into my practice? And I started having panic attacks that were so bad that I wasn't really able to do the acro that I wanted to do. And that also coincided with COVID. And, a lot of things were shut down anyway, as it is.
Which, like, COVID happened when Saturn was in Capricorn, very
Right.
strong Saturn, able to
Right.
like make everyone feel isolated and stay at home,
Right.
you know?
Right. Like, fully able to have its resourcing. And so I listened to my body, and I stopped pushing myself in the way that I was pushing myself. And that was when I started taking astrology courses and really started diving into my studies and reading a lot and going on long walks and listening to podcasts and prioritizing my knowledge instead of driving. I was going out of town like 3 to 4 days a week, driving long distances just to see friends and to train and to do acro and to like keep up with this circus stuff. But where was that getting me in the long run? And now that I look back on it, I feel like that really was in some way like a premonition, or my body like warning me, hey, you're gonna get injured if you don't listen to me, if you don't stop doing this in the way that you're doing this, there's going to be an injury. But I feel like that's almost the difference between having a really dignified Saturn, is mine manifested as just like debilitating dreams, and like premonition and like fear, um which stopped an actual problem. It stopped an actual injury from happening because I listened to it, and I felt like I got rewarded, because the second I started announcing that I was an astrologer, not knowing how people were going to take that or how the reaction was going to be, I instantly found success and found clients and found a home, and everything has been so easy with that career. And it's the first time in my life anything has ever felt easy. And so yeah, I think Saturn can definitely bring a lot of gifts. I have found it to, because especially it's in my 8th house. I have found a lot of like joy and like a lot of good from my Saturn placement, but I also have had to work really, really hard at a lot of what I do, and I had to listen to my body before it like became a problem. And now I think I see people come to me all the time with these like crazy injuries or crazy accidents that happen during Saturn cycles, and I really feel like that was like a warning, or it almost like a confirmation.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
Well,
that's a good
Saturn,
thing.
like continuing with the sect, right? So if you have a
Yeah.
day chart, then Saturn will work a lot better for you in your chart because
Yes.
like temperamentally, Saturn is cold and dry. And so the warmth of the day kind of like, and Saturn's more external, like it brings Saturn out so you can build in the world, which is what you're doing during day. Whereas people with night charts, Mars will work a little better for us because night cools Mars off a little more. But then people with night charts, Saturn then becomes your out of sect malefic, who will be your most difficult planet.
Yeah.
And then the houses ruled by Saturn, you know, wherever Aquarius and Capricorn are in your chart, may be the most difficult things that you experience in your life, whatever those topics are. And yeah, like I have Saturn in the 6th house. I have Saturn conjunct my moon. So there's just a lot of ways that Saturn can come in and mess with my body. I also have a Jupiter ruled Saturn and Saturn in close conversation with Jupiter. So I have a lot of resources and support to deal with those, you know, so there can be these contradictions that come through with how things show up in your life, right? Because being alive is very contradictory. But yeah, Saturn is so slow moving that we see her coming. Like Saturn rules clarity. Saturn transits will bring clarity, even if it's not always nice or comfortable. And Saturn issues are the type of issues where it's like, oh yeah, I know I need to pay my taxes. I know I need to pay my taxes. And if you don't, then you have consequences, which is another Saturn signification. But like, if you see those issues coming, and especially knowing what houses are ruled by Saturn in your chart, what house Saturn is in your chart, knowing that those will be the places where the Saturn issues come through the most, you know, like when Saturn transits through your 6th house, make sure you have health insurance because you might have health things that come up if Saturn transits through your 7th house. I mean, Saturn can also be a really good relationship signifier, which I was taught by Kelly Surtees, because Saturn can bring longevity and stability and structure. So Saturn in your 7th house could be a bad breakup. Saturn rules endings. But if you're in a healthy, good relationship, it could create like a, not even if you're in a healthy, good relationship, but you know, Saturn could create a long-term relationship that then becomes a marriage. You just have to be careful that it doesn't become like brittle and dry over time. But yeah, Saturn issues, you see them coming, don't procrastinate, deal with them, and then you generally will be rewarded. Whereas Mars issues will be a lot more like surprise accidents, you know, injuries, things that like you did not expect. And you know, and like I tore my ACL when Saturn and Mars conjoined on top of my moon in my 6th house, right? So it's like, and then I needed surgery, which is Mars, right? And so Saturn definitely brought the injury forward, but like that accident, the like ski accident was Mars there as well. So
yeah.
Yeah.
There's so much that Saturn can bring.
Yeah, and Saturn's very serious, right? So whatever houses are ruled by Saturn in your chart, you want to take very seriously. Yeah, and then Aquarius is fixed air. So Saturn functioning in a more like social communicative way and very, very stubborn, very, very like sturdy and consistent. Whereas Capricorn is cardinal earth. So you know, Capricorn season initiates winter. It's the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere. And so Earth is a lot slower moving than like fire, right? Aries is like initiate, let's go, go. But Capricorn is still taking slow, concerted action and effort towards building something of substance that will last, right? That's what Saturn wants to do. And when you have a lot of Saturn planets, you'll be focused on doing that. And especially when you have Saturn in domicile, like that's not necessarily the most comfy thing, but like people with Saturn in domicile tend to be incredibly successful, depending again on placements and aspects and other mitigating factors, because they are the ones who are able to work really hard over an extended period of time to achieve results.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Well, should we wrap up and say what we have going on?
Yeah. You want to go first?
Sure. So I have my readings open on my website. There's a link to my website down below. I offer just like regular astrology readings, 30, 60, and 90 minutes. The 30 minutes can be a really great way to just get like a mini astrology reading. They're a little more affordable and accessible if you just want to talk about one life topic. We can talk about like, money, relationships, work, whatever's going on in your life and get clarity with the astrology on that. I also offer herbal astrology readings. I'm an herbalist, so we can talk about your health and vitality and wellness through like just education and recommendations from an herbal and astrological perspective. And then I also offer asteroid astrology readings where we can look at what asteroids are prominent in your chart and what mythic stories you're living out. So yeah, I'd love to work with some of you if you are interested. The link's down below to book a reading with me. What about you, Lori?
Yeah. Well, I've been still with the shop and hosting a lot of workshops and events and everything. Just got back from Norwalk. Now we're right outside of Denver, and yeah, I've been traveling a lot. I'm going to San Francisco after this too. So things have been a little crazy, but I am still doing a lot of readings.
In person and online, right?
Yeah, I do offer online. Most of what I do is in person at this point, just because I prefer one-on-one people time. But yes, I do absolutely offer virtual as well. I also do all types of different readings, and my readings are basically kind of unstructured. I start with the hour, and then I just charge by the half hour after that, and kind of just go as long as it feels like it needs to go, unless there's any kind of constraints on time or money or whatever. And I'll open up whatever needs to be opened up. So
Awesome. Yeah, and my readings are mostly virtual, although if you are in Oregon, I'm down to meet in person. But for folks who are more virtual, you can definitely go that way with my readings. And yeah, we'll be recording more episodes about dignity in all of the different forms with astrology. So this is just the first of a series. And we also have a Instagram for Conversations with the Planets, which is also linked below. So please go follow that so you can get
and
updates.
you can reach out to both of us on Instagram as
Yes,
well.
please. We love hearing from folks. So
And
please
if
reach out.
there's any episodes you want to hear, or if you have any asteroid stories, or if you have anything you want to share, I'm writing a book on the asteroids right now. If there's anything you want to talk to us about, yeah, feel free to
Please reach out.
reach out. We love them.
Yeah, we love hearing from you guys. So yeah, thank you so much, and we'll talk soon.